You want to know the strangest part? It wasn't the firefight. It wasn't the helicopters or the blood or the screaming over the radio. The strangest part was the silence after. The kind of silence that sits on your chest like a wet sandbag and won't move. We were sure he was dead, all of us. We'd already started grieving him before the dust had even settled. And then she walked back in. Let me back up. I need to tell this right because if I rush it you won't believe me and I don't blame you. I barely believe it myself some nights. Let me start where it started. My name doesn't matter much for this. The guys called me Stitch because back in training I sewed up my own arm with fishing line and a needle from a first aid kit when the medic was busy with somebody worse off. I wasn't trying to be tough. I just didn't want to bleed on the gear. The name stuck. That's how it usually goes. I was the comms guy for our unit. 8 men, 1 commander, and 1 shooter who wasn't technically one of us but might as well have been. I'll get to her. We were stationed in a place I'm not allowed to name, in a country with mountains so high the clouds sat below you in the mornings. You'd wake up and look down at a sea of white, like the whole world had been erased overnight, and somewhere under all that softness there were men who wanted you dead. That contrast never left me, the beauty and the danger in the same breath. The valley we worked was called something in the local language that translated roughly to the place where the river forgets itself. A river ran through it that split into a dozen smaller streams and then vanished into the rocks. Easy to get lost down there. Easy to die down there. The locals avoided it after dark. Our commander was a man named Eli Sorenson. Lieutenant commander, but nobody called him that unless Brass was around. To us, he was just Sorenson, or sometimes Sorry, which started as a joke and became something else entirely. Because Sorenson was never sorry about anything. He was the most decided man I ever met. He'd make a call in half a second and stick to it even if the sky fell, and somehow the sky never quite fell on him. He was a big guy, not loud big, quiet big, the kind of man who could fill a room without saying a word. He had this scar through one eyebrow that made him look permanently skeptical, and a way of listening to you with his whole face that made you feel like the only person on earth. When Sorenson asked how you were doing, you didn't give him the automatic fine. You actually thought about it. He had a wife back home named Carol and a daughter named June who was 7 that year. He kept a photo of June in his vest, laminated so the sweat wouldn't ruin it. She had a gap where her front teeth used to be, and she was holding a fish she'd caught that was almost as big as her arm. Sorenson would look at that photo before every op, not for luck. He told me once it was to remind himself what he was protecting wasn't an idea. It was a kid with a gap in her teeth. I think about that a lot. Now the shooter. Her name was Marquin. And before you ask, yes, she was attached to a SEAL element, and no, I'm not going to argue with you about the technicalities of it, because the people who weren't there always want to argue about who's allowed to be where, and the people who were there don't care. MARA could outshoot every man on that team and most men anywhere. That's the only fact that mattered when the rounds were flying. She'd come up through a different pipeline, a quieter one, the kind nobody talks about at parties. Reconnaissance, then designated marksman, then a specialty that turned her into something close to a ghost. She was on loan to us for a stretch of operations that needed her particular skill, which was the ability to lie absolutely still for 18 hours and then end a problem from 1,100 meters out without anyone ever knowing she'd been there. When she first showed up, the guys did what guys do. They tested her. Not cruel, just dumb. Carter, our youngest, big mouth, good heart, asked her if she needed help carrying her ruck. She looked at him for a long second, then picked up his ruck instead of hers, walked it the full 2 clicks to the staging point, set it down, and said, "You look tired." Carter never opened his mouth about her again. Started bringing her coffee, actually. The way a little brother apologizes without ever saying the word sorry. Mara wasn't cold. People who didn't know her thought she was cold because she didn't waste words, but she noticed everything. She'd know if you hadn't slept. She'd know if you got a bad letter from home before you told anybody. She had this stillness to her that I came to understand wasn't emptiness. It was the opposite. It was a person paying so much attention to the world that talking would just get in the way. She and SOREN had a thing between them. Not romantic, get that out of your head right now, because everyone always goes there and it cheapens it. It was something harder to explain. Respect that went all the way down. He trusted her judgment more than he trusted his own sometimes, and she trusted him to listen. On a team, that's rarer than love. Love is everywhere. Two people who genuinely trust each other's read on a bad situation, that's almost impossible to find. He used to say, if QUINN says don't, we don't. Simple as that. The whole team learned to read her like a weather vane. If MARA got quiet in a particular way, we got ready. If MARA said a place felt wrong, we found another way around. 3 times that quiet saved our lives before the day. Everything went sideways. The 4th time, it didn't get the chance. It was a Tuesday. I remember because Carter had been complaining all week that we always seemed to get hit on Tuesdays, and we'd told him to shut up about it. And then it happened on a Tuesday. And after that, nobody teased him about being superstitious ever again. The mission was supposed to be simple. They always say that, and it's never true, but this one really should have been. We had intel, solid intel, double-sourced, the kind you don't get often, that a high-value man was moving through the valley with a small protection detail. Maybe a dozen fighters. We were to set up, confirm, and take him. MARA would be our overwatch, perched high on the eastern ridge with eyes on the whole approach. The rest of us would move down into the valley floor and set the trap. The weather was clean that morning, cold but clear. You could see for miles. There was frost on everything, and it cracked under our boots no matter how careful we were. And SOREN kept giving us this look like we were a bunch of elephants. And Carter whispered, "Sorry, boss," every time he snapped a twig, until SOREN finally whispered back, "If you say sorry one more time, I'm leaving you here for the goats." That's the thing nobody tells you about war. There's so much laughing in it, right up until there isn't. We got into position before dawn. MARA checked in from the ridge, 2 clicks on the radio, which meant she was set and she had eyes. I can still hear those 2 clicks. Tap, tap. The most ordinary sound in the world, and it's burned into me forever. The sun came up slow. The mist in the valley turned gold, then white, then burned off entirely, and the river started to shine like somebody had laid a strip of broken glass through the rocks. It was, I'm not kidding, one of the most beautiful mornings of my life. I remember thinking that, lying in the dirt with my rifle, that it was beautiful, and then feeling guilty for thinking it, like beauty was a thing I hadn't earned. Then MARA Quotes's voice came over the radio, low and even. "Movement, north entrance, counts higher than briefed." SOREN keyed back, "How much higher?" A pause, just long enough to make my stomach drop. "A lot higher," MARA said. "This isn't a protection detail, this is a column." Here's what the intel had missed. The high-value man wasn't traveling light through our valley by accident. He was using it as a corridor. And behind him, strung out along the river road, were not a dozen fighters but something closer to 60. Maybe more. They came around the bend in 2s and 3s and kept coming, and I lay there in the frost counting them and feeling the math go very, very bad. 8 of us, 1 on the ridge, 60 plus of them. SOREN didn't panic. I never once saw him panic. He keyed the radio and said, calm as a man ordering breakfast, "We're not taking this fight. We're breaking contact and we're gone. QUINN, you cover us out the south draw. Everybody else on me, quiet and quick." It was the right call, the only call, and we almost made it. We were maybe 200 meters into the withdrawal, moving low along a dry stream bed, when one of their flankers, a kid probably, scouting wide off the main column, stumbled right onto our path. He saw us. We saw him. For one frozen second, nobody did anything. Then he started screaming. After that, it was all noise. The whole valley opened up. rounds chewing the rocks above us, dirt jumping in little fountains, the air full of that sound that isn't quite a sound, more like the air itself getting torn. We returned fire and moved, fired and moved, the way we'd done 1,000 times in training and 100 times for real, and Sorensen's voice cut through all of it, steady, telling us where to go, who to cover, when to bound. Mara was working the ridge. I could hear her shots even over the chaos because hers were different, spaced, deliberate, each one meaning something. Every time her rifle spoke, somebody on their side stopped being a problem. She was buying us time with her patience, one breath and one trigger pull at a time. We were going to make it. I really believed that. We were almost to the mouth of the South Draw, where the rocks would close in and give us cover and channel them into a place we could hold. And then the mortar came. You don't hear the one that gets close. People say that, and it's true. You hear the far ones, the ones walking toward you, crump, crump, and you have just enough time to think, please not closer, and then the close one doesn't announce itself at all. It just is. One instant the world is one way, and the next instant the world is upside down and full of ringing, and your mouth tastes like a battery. I was thrown. Landed hard against a boulder, lost my rifle, couldn't hear anything but a high whine. I remember looking at my own hand and not being sure it was mine. I remember the sky being in the wrong place. When I got my eyes working, I saw Carter dragging Reyes by the drag handle, both of them bloody but moving. I saw Okonkwo laying down fire from one knee with blood running down the side of his face. I saw the rest of the team scattered across the streambed like somebody had dropped us from a great height. And I saw the place where Sorensen had been. The mortar had hit close to the front of our group, right about where our commander had been moving. There was a crater there now, and smoke, and rocks that hadn't been there a minute ago, and no Sorensen. I started crawling toward it. I don't remember deciding to. Okonkwo grabbed my vest and hauled me back and screamed something I couldn't hear, and then I could hear, the ringing dropping away just enough, and what he was screaming was, "He's gone, we gotta move, Stitch, he's gone." I looked again. I want you to understand that I looked. The slope above the crater had come down. Tons of rock and earth, sheared loose by the blast, sliding into the streambed and burying everything at the bottom of it. Where the front of our column had been, there was now just a fresh scar of broken mountain. No Sorensen, no body, nothing a man could be alive under. The enemy was still coming. We had wounded. We had no choice that any sane person would call a choice. We left. That's the part I have to make you understand, because everything after only matters if you understand this. We did not leave because we were cowards. We did not leave because we didn't love him. We left because Sorensen himself had drilled into every one of us a single rule, repeated so many times it was carved into our bones. The mission is to bring the living home. You do not trade 5 breathing men for one you can't save. He'd said it standing right in front of us. He'd said if it was ever him, we were to go. He made us promise. Carter had cried the night he made us promise, and Sorensen had put a hand on the back of his neck and said, "It's not gonna be me, kid. But if it is, you go and you live, and that's how you carry me. You don't bury yourself next to me. You live loud enough for both of us." So we went. We carried Reyes and we dragged each other and we fought our way down the South Draw, and Mara covered us from the ridge until the last possible second, dropping anyone who tried to follow. And then she was supposed to displace and meet us at the extraction point. She didn't. When the birds finally came in, beating down through the cold air with their miniguns reaching back up the valley, we loaded our wounded and we counted heads, and we came up too short. Sorensen buried under a mountain, and Mara just gone. The ridge had gone quiet. Her radio had gone quiet. The last thing anyone had from her was a single transmission, broken up by static and gunfire, that I caught on my receiver and that none of us could make sense of at the time. She'd said, "Going dark, don't wait for me." And then nothing. I want to tell you about the helicopter ride out, because that's where the grief started, and grief is its own kind of operation. It has phases. It has a beginning. The bird was loud and freezing and full of the smell of blood and aviation fuel. Reyes was on the floor with the medic working on his leg, and the rest of us were jammed against the bulkheads, and nobody said a word for a long time. We just looked at each other and looked at the empty space where two people should have been sitting and looked away. Carter broke first. He was 22 years old and he had just watched his commander vanish under a landslide and his. I don't even know what Mara was to Carter, an older sister, a hero, a person who'd carried his ruck to teach him a lesson and then started bringing him coffee, disappear off a ridge into silence. He put his face in his hands and his shoulders started shaking, and Okonkwo, who was bleeding from his own head, leaned over and pulled Carter against his chest and held him there the whole flight, and didn't say anything, because there wasn't anything. I looked out the open door at the mountain sliding by below, all that beauty, all that white, and I thought about June with the gap in her teeth, holding a fish. I thought about who was going to tell her. I thought about Carol opening her door to two men in dress uniforms and knowing, the way they always know, before anyone says a word. And I thought about Mara, going dark, don't wait for me. What did that mean? At the time it felt like goodbye. It felt like a woman who knew she was about to be overrun and didn't want us dying trying to reach her. It felt like the last brave thing a brave person says. I didn't understand it. None of us did, not for 3 days. Back at the fire base, they put us through the machine, debriefs, medical, the endless paperwork of catastrophe. Reyes went into surgery and came out missing some of his leg but keeping his life. Okonkwo got stitched up and refused to be evacuated because he wasn't leaving while 2 of ours were still out there in whatever state they were in. We didn't say dead at first. We said unaccounted for. That's the language they give you to hold the door open a crack, even when you know the door is shut. But by the end of the first day, the crack started to close. A drone went over the valley and confirmed the landslide, a huge gray wound down the mountainside, exactly where Sorensen had been. Nothing could have lived under that. The analysts said it plain. The terrain had buried the entire front of our position under an estimated thousands of tons of rock. And the ridge where Mara had been was overrun. The drone showed enemy crawling all over it. Her hide site, the place she'd fired from, was a churned-up mess. No sign of her. No sign of a body, but in that terrain with that many enemy, the absence of a body wasn't hope. It was just the worst kind of uncertainty. By the second day, command made it official in the careful way they do. Sorensen, presumed killed in action. Mara, missing, presumed killed. That word, presumed. It's a coward's word and a kind word at the same time. It lets you grieve while leaving a tiny, cruel window open. We grieved. I have been to a lot of memorials. Out there, before the official ceremonies, the guys hold their own. It's not in any manual. You take the things that mattered. You put them in a line. You stand around them in the cold and you say what you have to say. For Sorensen, somebody set out a pair of his boots. I don't know who got them from his gear, and I never asked. We put his boots in the dirt outside the tents, and Okonkwo set Sorensen's spare patrol cap on top, and somebody, Carter, I think, laid down a photo. Not the laminated one of June. That had been on Sorensen's vest and was gone with him. This was a different one, of the whole team, taken 6 weeks earlier. All of us grinning like idiots after a good op. Sorensen in the middle with his arm around 2 of us. That skeptical scar of an eyebrow somehow looking happy. We stood around the boots. The wind came down off the mountains, and it was so cold it hurt the inside of my nose. Okonkwo spoke first. Because he was the senior man left and that was his job now, whether he wanted it or not, he said, he told us to live loud enough for both of us. His voice cracked on loud. He stopped, breath started again. So we're gonna do that, that's the order, last order, we live loud. Then he was quiet, and everybody understood the speech was over because there wasn't more. There was just a man trying not to fall apart in front of his guys. We left Mara's spot empty next to the boots. We didn't have anything of hers. She traveled light, left nothing behind, never had. That was almost worse, the empty space, the place where her things should have been and weren't. A ghost even in death. Carter put a cup of coffee there, just set it down in the dirt where her gear would have gone. Steam coming off it in the cold. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. The little brother apologizing one more time to someone who couldn't hear it. I watched that coffee go cold over the next hour. I couldn't stop watching it. The steam thinning, then gone. The surface going still. It's a stupid thing to fixate on, but that's grief. It picks something small and it won't let you look away. That night I couldn't sleep. None of us could, really, but I gave up the pretense and went outside and sat against the sandbags and looked up at the stars, which out there are violent in their brightness. So many of them it doesn't even look like the sky I grew up under. Okonkwo came and sat next to me after a while. We didn't talk for a long time. Then he said, "You catch what she said, Quinn, on the radio, end of it." "Going dark, don't wait for me," I said. "Yeah, I caught it." He nodded slowly. "Don't wait for me," he repeated. "Not I'm hit, not I'm surrounded, not goodbye." He turned and looked at me, and there was something in his face I couldn't read in the dark. "Don't wait for me," like she had somewhere to be. I hadn't thought of it that way. I'd heard it as surrender, a last transmission. But Okonkwo was right. It wasn't the language of someone giving up. It was the language of someone who'd made a decision and didn't want anybody slowing her down. "You think I started." "I don't think anything," Okonkwo said, too fast, in the voice of a man slamming a door on a hope because hope was the most dangerous thing he could afford right now. "I think she's gone. I think they're both gone. Don't do that to yourself, Stitch. Don't go down that road. It only ends one way and the ending's the same either way." He was right. He was being kind. The kind thing out there is usually the thing that hurts now so it hurts less later. So I didn't go down the road. I closed the door on it too. I told myself the boots in the dirt were the truth. I told myself the cold coffee was the truth. I told myself we'd lost two of the best people I'd ever known, and that the world was a worse place for it, and that all that was left was to live loud like he'd ordered. I believed all of that completely for 3 days. And on the third day, just before sunset, the perimeter guard called in something on the radio that made every single one of us stop breathing. A figure, 2 figures actually, coming out of the foothills to the east, slow, one of them carrying the other, moving toward our wire across open ground in the last gold light of the day. The guard's voice was shaking when he said it. "I got boss, I don't know what I'm looking at. I think one of 'em's carrying a body. And boss, the one walking, I think it's a woman. I have run a lot of distances in my life. Toward things, away from things. But I have never moved the way I moved when that radio call came in. 1 second I was sitting on a cot pretending to clean a rifle I'd already cleaned twice. The next second I was outside, no jacket, in air cold enough to slap the breath out of me, running for the eastern wire with half the camp running beside me." The guard hadn't been wrong to call it in shaking, because what was out there, crossing that open ground in the dying gold light, didn't make sense to anybody's eyes at first. 2 figures, one upright walking, one slung over the other's shoulders in a fireman's carry, dead weight, arms swinging. And the one walking was small, too small to be carrying a grown man that size. The body draped over her shoulders was clearly bigger than she was, and she had it up there anyway, and she was moving, not fast. You can't move fast under that kind of load, but steady. Step, step, step. The way you move when you've decided that stopping is the same as dying, and you've simply removed stopping from the list of things you're allowed to do. We reached the wire. Okonkwo got there first somehow on legs that should have been too torn up for it, and he was screaming at the guard tower to hold fire, and he was waving his arms, and the whole camp had its weapons up because you do not let unidentified figures walk to your wire. Not out there, not ever, but Okonkwo was screaming, and something in his voice made the muzzles drop one by one. Because by then we could see her face. It was Mara. I want to describe what she looked like, but I'm not sure I have the words. I'll try. She had been out there 3 days. 3 days in those mountains in that cold, with the enemy crawling all over the high ground, carrying a man twice her weight. Her face was the color of old paper. There was dried blood on the side of her head, a long crust of it down past her ear, and more blood on her hands, and her hands didn't look like hands anymore. They looked like things that had been used as tools, raw and swollen and locked into the shape of carrying. Her eyes were the worst part. They weren't wild. I'd expected wild. They were the opposite. They were flat and calm and fixed on a point about 20 feet past all of us, and she walked straight at that point like none of us were there, because in whatever place she'd gone in her head to survive the last 3 days, we weren't there. Nothing was there except the next step. She made it to the wire. She made it through the gap. And then she stopped, and she very, very carefully went down on one knee, and she lowered the body off her shoulders into the dirt with a gentleness that broke something in my chest, the gentleness of someone who has carried something precious a very long way and is afraid of dropping it at the very end. And she said, in a voice that was barely a voice at all, scraped down to nothing, "He's alive. He's been alive the whole time. Somebody help me." It was Sorensen. I need you to understand that no part of me believed it even while I was looking at it. We had drilled it into ourselves for 3 days that he was dead. We put his boots in the dirt. We'd grieved him through the worst night of our lives. The drone had shown us the landslide. The math had been certain. Dead is dead. You learn out there to accept dead because the alternative, hopping, gets people killed. And now here he was in the dirt at our feet, gray and broken and barely breathing, but his chest was moving. I watched it. I watched his chest rise and fall, and I could not make my brain accept the information my eyes were sending it. The medic was already on him. Doc Prout, who just spent 3 days reassembling Rays, was on his knees in the dirt with his bag open, hands flying, calling out numbers and orders, and the calm in his voice was the trained calm of a man who is screaming on the inside. Sorensen's pulse was there but thready. His leg was a horror, splinted, but splinted with sticks and strips of cloth, field expedient, the kind of splint you make when you have nothing but the land in your hands. He was dehydrated to the edge of death, hypothermic. He had a head wound and a chest that crackled when he breathed. But he was alive. He had been alive under that mountain, and Mara had dug him out. They got him on a litter and ran him to the aid station, and the camp went into the particular chaos of a sudden critical casualty. And through all of it, Mara just stayed where she was, kneeling in the dirt at the wire, swaying slightly, watching them carry him away. I knelt down next to her. Up close she smelled like blood and cold rock and something underneath that I realized was just exhaustion, if exhaustion has a smell, which I think it does. "Mara," I said, "Mara, hey, it's Stitch, you're home, you made it, you can stop now." She turned her head and looked at me, and for a second the flat calm in her eyes cracked, and behind it was something so deep and so tired that I almost couldn't hold her gaze. She'd been holding the whole world up on her back for 3 days, and I think the only thing that had kept her standing was the refusal to set it down. And now that she'd set it down, the cost of carrying it was coming due all at once. "I couldn't leave him," she said. "Stitch. I couldn't leave him there. He's got the kid, the fish, June, I couldn't." And then she fell over. I caught her. She weighed almost nothing, which was insane, because she just carried a man twice her size across miles of mountain. The body does impossible things and then it sends you the bill. Doc Prout's assistant got to us and we got her onto a litter too, and as they lifted her she grabbed my wrist with one of those ruined hands, with a grip that still, even then, was stronger than it had any right to be, and she said one more thing before she went under. She said, "Don't let them tell you I left him. I never left him, not once." I told her nobody would ever say that. I told her she was the bravest person I'd ever known. I don't know if she heard me. Her eyes had already gone somewhere else. They carried her into the aid station after Sorensen, and the flap dropped behind them, and I was left kneeling in the dirt at the wire with the cold coming down and the last gold light going out over the mountains. And I looked at my own wrist where her bloody hand had gripped it, and I started shaking, and I couldn't stop for a long time. Here is what we pieced together later, partly from Mara, partly from Sorensen once he could talk, partly from the marks the land itself had left on both of them. I'm going to tell it to you the way I came to understand it, which is to say I'm going to tell it like I was there, even though I wasn't, because by the time I'd heard it enough times it lived in me like a memory. When the mortar hit, it didn't bury Sorensen the way we thought. The blast threw him the same way it threw me, but it threw him sideways and down into a gap in the rocks, a kind of crevice at the base of the slope. And then the slope came down. Tons of it. But the rocks above the crevice he'd landed in formed a rough arch, by pure dumb luck, by the cruel and merciful geometry of falling stone, and the landslide poured over the top of him instead of crushing him flat. He was buried, but he was buried in a pocket, a coffin with a little bit of air in it. Pinned, his legs shattered, half-conscious in the dark under a mountain. We'd looked right at that slope and seen a grave, and it was a grave. It just happened to have a man still breathing inside it. From up on the ridge, Mara had seen the mortar hit. She'd seen where he went down, and here is the thing that I will carry for the rest of my life. She didn't see him die. We saw the slope come down and we did the math, and the math said dead. But Mara, through her scope, from 1,000 meters up, had watched the exact spot, and what she'd seen was a man go into a gap in the rocks an instant before the slope buried it. And in the half-second of math that everyone has to do in that moment, her math came out different from ours. Her math said, maybe. And so when Okonkwo screamed, he's gone, and we broke contact and ran, Mara, up on the ridge, made a different choice. She covered our withdrawal. She did that first, she got us out. Every shot she fired in those last minutes was for us. And then when we were clear, when she was supposed to displace and run for the extraction point, she keyed her radio and said the only thing she had time to say. Going dark, don't wait for me. And then she turned off her radio, because a live radio is a thing that can be tracked and a thing that can argue with you. And she went down off the back of that ridge into a valley full of 60 enemy fighters, alone, to dig a man out of a mountain that everyone else had already decided was his tomb. I asked her much later why. Not why she went, I understood why she went. Why she turned the radio off. Why she cut herself off from us, from rescue, from any chance that someone would come help. She thought about it for a long time, the way she thought about everything, and then she said, because if I left it on, you'd have told me he was dead. And you'd have been right. The smart money was that he was dead. And I knew that if I heard somebody I trusted say it out loud, with the math behind it, I might believe it. And if I believed it, I'd have run for the extraction point like I was supposed to. And he'd have died alone in the dark under a mountain 100 meters from where I was standing. She looked at her hands when she said it. They were healing by then, but they'd never be the same. I couldn't risk being talked out of it, she said, even by the truth, especially by the truth, so I made it where the truth couldn't reach me, and I went and got our guy. I think about that more than almost anything else from those years. We had logic on our side. We had the drone footage and the math and the rule Sorensen himself had drilled into us. Don't trade 5 living men for one you can't save. We followed the rule. We were right to follow the rule. And Mara broke it. She broke the rule and turned off her radio so the rule couldn't catch her, and she was wrong to do it by every measure of sense and odds and training, and she did it anyway, and because she did it, a little girl named June still had a father. Sometimes the right call and the true thing are not the same thing. I learned that out there. I'm still not sure what to do with it. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm telling you the why before I've told you the how. And the how is the part that makes my hands cold even now. Because getting down off that ridge alive was the easy part. Finding the right spot in the slope, the exact gap, The one pocket among 1,000 tons of fallen mountain where a man might still be breathing was not. And digging him out by hand, with the enemy occupying the high ground above her and patrols moving through the valley below, with no tools but a folding knife and an entrenching tool and her own 2 hands, in the cold, in the dark, knowing that any sound she made might be the sound that got her killed. That part took her the better part of a day and a night. And it was only the beginning of the 3 days. She told it to us in pieces, never all at once, never willingly. She wasn't the type to tell war stories, but over months in the quiet hours when something would remind her, a little would come out and we'd hold our breath and not say anything for fear of making her stop, and slowly we got the shape of it. How she'd marked the spot in her mind from the ridge before she came down, because once she was at the bottom the whole slope looked the same, just gray broken rock, and there was no obvious place to dig. How she'd lain in a ditch for hours waiting for a patrol to pass, close enough to hear them talking, close enough to smell their cigarettes, while somewhere under the rocks 100 meters away the clock was running out on the man she'd come for. How she'd started digging in the last light of that first day, and how the first thing she found wasn't him. It was his rifle, sheared in half, and how for one terrible moment she thought the rifle meant she was in the right place and the wrong place at the same time, that he was right there, and right there was a grave. And then how she'd heard it. Faint from under the rock, so faint she thought at first it was her own pulse in her ears. A sound. Sorensen, buried alive in the dark, half a day after everyone he loved had given him up for dead, had heard scraping above him. And with the last of the air in his crushed chest, he had done the only thing he could do. He had started to sing. It was an old song. That's the part that always gets me. Not a hymn, not an anthem, nothing you'd expect a dying man to reach for. It was a stupid, gentle little song that Sorensen used to sing to his daughter. June's song. He'd told us about it once, on a long, boring night on a rooftop somewhere, embarrassed, the way big men get embarrassed about the soft things. He said June wouldn't sleep unless he sang it, and he'd made up half the words because he could never remember the real ones. And now it was their song, the wrong words and all, and she'd correct him if he tried to fix it. That's what Myra heard coming up through the rock. A man buried alive, with a shattered leg and a chest full of broken glass, singing his daughter's bedtime song into the dark because it was the only sound he had left to make, and because if he was going to die under a mountain, he was going to die with her voice in his head, gapped teeth, and a fish too big for her arms. Mara told us she nearly didn't believe it. She'd been digging on hope, on a half-second of math from 1,000 meters up, and hope is a thin thing to dig with. And then she heard the song, faint and broken and wrong-worded, and she said the hope turned into something else, something with weight, something she could put her back into. She dug toward the sound. She had a folding knife and a small entrenching tool in her hands. That was it. The rock was the kind of broken mountain that shifts when you touch it, pull one stone, and 3 more slide down to take its place, and any one of them could come down on the very man you're trying to reach. So she couldn't just dig. She had to dig carefully in the dark, by feel, listening to the rock the way she listened to everything, learning which stones were load-bearing and which were loose, building little walls of the loose ones to hold back the slide while she worked deeper. It took hours. The song would fade, Sorensen drifting out of consciousness, and she'd stop and put her face down against the cold rock and call to him. Not loud, never loud, because the valley was full of men who'd kill them both. Just loud enough. Keep singing, Eli, keep singing, I'm coming, you keep singing. And after a while the song would start again, weaker, and she'd dig toward it. At one point a patrol came through. She heard them on the road below, and she went flat against the rocks and held still, and she said the worst part wasn't the fear of being found. The worst part was that she had to make Sorensen stop singing. She had to put her mouth to the gap she'd opened and whisper, quiet now, quiet, they're close. And then she had to lie there in the dark, not knowing if the silence on the other side meant he understood or meant he died, while she waited for the patrol to pass. When the patrol was gone, she scraped at the rock and whispered for him, and there was nothing, and she dug faster, less careful now, the wall of loose stones forgotten, and just as the slide started to shift under her hands, she heard it again. The song, the wrong words, faint as a heartbeat. She got her arm through. She felt his hand in the dark. He grabbed it, she said, with more strength than a man in his state should have had, the same kind of strength she'd grab my wrist with 3 days later, the strength that comes from somewhere past the body, and he stopped singing. And in a voice like gravel, he said the first words he'd said to another human being in over 12 hours. He said, "You're supposed to be gone. I ordered you gone." And Mara, with her arm buried to the shoulder in a mountain, holding her commander's hand in the dark, said, "Yeah, well, I turned my radio off. Didn't hear you." Getting him out of the pocket was its own small war, and I won't pretend I can describe all of it, because some of it she never described, because some things you carry out of a place like that and never set down for anyone. But the broad strokes she gave us, eventually, in fragments. His leg was destroyed. Not just broken, destroyed. The kind of injury that on a normal day means a helicopter and a surgical team and a long road after. She had to get him out of a hole in a collapsing mountain with that leg in the dark, silently, alone. She splinted it first, down in the hole by feel, with sticks she'd gathered and strips cut from her own clothing and his, because she knew the moment she started to move him the pain would try to make him scream, and a scream would kill them. She told him that. She put her mouth next to his ear and she said, "When I move you, it's going to be the worst thing that's ever happened to you, and you cannot make a sound. If you make a sound, we both die, and your kid grows up with 2 men in dress uniforms at the door. So you bite down on this." She'd given him a strap of webbing to bite, "and you go somewhere else in your head, and you do not make a sound." And Sorensen, and this is the man I served under, this is exactly the man. Sorensen nodded and bit down on the strap, and the only sound he made while she dragged him out of that mountain by his ruined body was breathing. Hard, ragged, agonized breathing through his nose, but not one cry, not one. She said it took her over an hour to move him 15 feet. By the time she got him fully clear of the slide and into the cover of a dry wash at the base of the slope, it was the dead middle of the night, and she had been awake and moving and fighting and digging for almost a full day, and they were 100 meters from a road that enemy patrols used, in a valley that the enemy now owned, with no radio, no support, no extraction, and a man who could not walk. That was the end of the rescue. It was the beginning of the part that I think is actually the hardest to comprehend. She still had to get him home. The straight-line distance from where Sorensen was buried to the nearest place we could safely reach with a helicopter was not far. On a map, it's almost nothing. But there is no straight line in mountains, and there is no straight line through enemy-held ground, and there is no straight line at all when you are carrying a man who cannot walk and you cannot use the roads and you can only move at night, and you have no food and almost no water and your own body is running on fumes. She figured it would take her 1 night. It took her 3. The first night she carried him on her back and they made it maybe 2 miles before the sky started to gray, and she had to find a hole to put them in for the day. She found a crack in the rocks, barely big enough for 2 people, and she dragged him into it and covered the entrance with brush, and they lay there pressed together for warmth through the daylight hours while patrols moved through the valley below them. She didn't sleep. She couldn't. She lay there holding her hand over Sorensen's mouth, ready, in case the pain or the fever made him cry out, while men with rifles walked past close enough to throw a stone at. He had a fever by then, the leg, the cold, infection setting in. He drifted in and out, and when he was out he'd sometimes mutter and she'd keep her hand ready over his mouth, and she said the things he muttered nearly broke her worse than the carrying did. He talked to June. He talked to Carol. He gave orders to men who weren't there. Once, she said, he clearly thought he was still under the rock, and he started to sing again, soft, the wrong words, and she had to clamp her hand down and whisper no. No, no song, not now, save it. Save it for when you're home. And he stopped, and a tear ran down the side of his face into the dirt. And she lay there in a hole in the ground in enemy country and cried silently next to him for the only time in the whole 3 days, because, she said, he was singing it like he already knew he wasn't going to get to sing it to her again. And I wasn't going to let that be true. The second night was worse than the first. She was weaker. He was heavier. Dead weight gets heavier every hour. That's just physics and exhaustion conspiring against you. She couldn't always carry him on her back anymore. Sometimes she had to drag him. She tore her hands apart on the rocks. She fell more than once, and falling with a man on your back in the dark is its own special horror, because you can't put your hands out to catch yourself without dropping him, and you can't drop him. So you fall badly on purpose to protect the cargo, and you get up and you do it again. She ran out of water the second night. There was a stream, she could hear it, the same river that gave the valley its name, the place where the river forgets itself. But getting to it meant crossing open ground near the road, and she watched it for an hour, and there was a static position there, an enemy watch post, and she couldn't risk it. So she didn't drink. She found a patch of old snow in a shaded crevice instead and ate that, and gave the meltwater to Sorensen drop by drop from a cloth, because he needed it more than she did, because a body-fighting infection burns through water, and because, she said this flatly like it was the most obvious thing in the world, he had a kid. I didn't. The math was easy. The math was easy. That's how she talked about deciding to die of thirst before she'd let him. By the third day she was hallucinating a little, she admitted, just at the edges, shapes that weren't there. She'd look at a rock and for a second it would be Carter or Okonkwo or her old spotter from years back who'd been killed in a different country in a different war. She said the dead kept her company those last hours, and she didn't find it frightening. She found it almost kind, like they'd come to walk her out. And the whole time, the one thing that didn't waver, the one thing that stayed bright and clear in the middle of all the gray fog of exhaustion, was the destination. Get him home. Get him to the wire. Get him to people who could save him. She'd reduced the entire world to a single arrow pointing east, and she followed that arrow with the dumb, mechanical persistence of something that has forgotten how to do anything but continue. Step, step, step. On the morning of the third day, just before dawn, she nearly lost him. His breathing changed. She knew that sound. Everyone who's been out there knows that sound, the change in a person's breathing that means the body is starting to let go. She was carrying him at the time, and she felt it more than heard it. The rhythm against her back going wrong, going slow, going shallow. She set him down. It was still dark. They were in the open, exposed, the worst possible place to stop, and she stopped anyway, because there was no point carrying a body the last mile. She did what she could. She got him flat. She got his airway clear. She breathed for him a few times. She pressed her ear to his chest and listened to a heart that was running out of reasons to keep going. And then she told us this part only once, late one night, months later, and her voice was very quiet. She leaned down and she sang the song. June's song, the wrong words and all. She'd heard enough of it through the rock and across 3 days of fevered muttering to have the shape of it. She put her mouth next to his ear, in the dark, in the open, in the most dangerous place in the world, and she sang a little girl's bedtime song to a dying man, soft as breath, and she sang it badly, and she sang it anyway. And his breathing steadied. She said she didn't know if it was the song or just the timing, just his body finding one more reserve it had been hiding. She wasn't a sentimental person and she wouldn't claim a miracle, but his breathing steadied, and after a while it deepened, and after a while longer she got him back up onto her shoulders, and she started walking again, east, toward the gray light, toward us. She'd been singing the song under her breath, she realized, for the last mile, just to keep him there, just to keep them both moving. A sniper who never wasted a word, walking out of an enemy valley with a broken man on her back, singing a child's lullaby into the dawn so that neither of them would stop. That's what the perimeter guard couldn't quite make sense of in his binoculars. Two figures coming out of the foothills in the last gold light of the third day, one carrying the other, and if he'd been close enough, he'd have heard it. He'd have heard her singing. I told you in the beginning that the strangest part wasn't the firefight. It was the silence after, the grief. But I was wrong about something, and I only figured it out years later, turning it over the way you turn over the few stories that end up defining your whole life. The strangest part wasn't the grief either. The strangest part was watching everything we'd been certain of get undone in a single evening. We knew he was dead. We'd put his boots in the dirt. We'd built our peace on the foundation of his death, the way you have to out there because you can't carry an open wound and a rifle at the same time. We'd accepted it. We'd grieved it. We'd started to heal around it. And then a small woman walked out of the foothills and set our certainty down in the dirt at our feet, gray and broken and breathing, and said, "Somebody help me." And we had to learn in 1 second that everything we'd made our peace with was wrong. You'd think that would be pure joy. And there was joy, more joy than I'd ever felt or have felt since. But there was something else in it too, something harder, and it took me a long time to find the word for it. Shame. Because we'd left. We'd followed the rule. We'd done the right thing, the smart thing, the thing he'd ordered us to do, and she hadn't, and she'd been right. And now we had to live in a world where the difference between a man's daughter having a father and not having one was that one of us had refused to accept the truth and the rest of us hadn't. I'll tell you how we lived with that. I'll tell you what Sorensen himself said about it once he could talk, because he had thoughts about it, strong ones, and they're not what you'd expect. But first I have to tell you what happened in that aid station over the next 48 hours. While a man who'd been dead for 3 days fought to stay undead, and a woman who'd carried him home lay on the cot next to him, refusing to let go of his hand even in her sleep. The aid station was a tent. I want you to keep that in your head because it matters. Not a hospital, not a building. A tent with canvas walls that breathed in the wind and a single string of lights running down the center pole, and a floor that was just the ground with a tarp thrown over it. That's where it all happened. That's where a man came back from the dead, in a tent, on a cot, under a string of lights in the middle of nowhere. Doc Prout worked on Sorensen for hours that first night. The leg was the loud problem, but the quiet problems were the ones that scared him. The chest, the fever, the way 3 days of being broken and frozen and starved had hollowed the man out from the inside. Prout later told me there were 3 or 4 separate moments that night where, in a hospital, he'd have called for a specialist, a machine, a thing he didn't have. He didn't have any of it. He had his hands and his bag and his training, and a man who would not quit. That was the thing that kept coming up from Prout, from everybody who was in that tent. Sorensen would not quit. His body had every reason to. By all the numbers he should have. But there was something in him that just kept hold of the edge and would not let go, hour after hour, and Prout said he'd seen a lot of men decide to live, and a lot of men decide to die, and you can usually tell which is which. And Sorensen had decided to live so hard it was almost frightening to be near. We found out later why. We should have guessed. He'd promised June he'd come home. He'd promised her on the video call before the deployment, the way you do, the easy lie that every parent tells, "I'll be home before you know it," except Sorensen didn't treat it as a lie. He treated it as an order he'd given himself. And Eli Sorensen did not break his own orders. Except one, we'll get to that. Mara should have been unconscious for a day. Her body had earned it. Prout got fluids into her and treated her hands and her head and told her, in the firm voice medics use, that she was going to sleep now whether she liked it or not. She slept for about 2 hours. Then she woke up, found the cot they'd put her on, found the cot they'd put Sorensen on next to it, and dragged herself the 3 feet between them, IV line and all, and took hold of his hand and would not be moved. Prout tried. He needed room to work. He told her gently to lie back down. She looked at him with those flat, calm eyes and said, I carried him 3 days. I'm not letting go of him in a tent." And Prout, who was a wise man, decided that a sniper holding her commander's hand was not, in fact, in his way, and let it be. So that's the picture. That's what I saw every time I stuck my head through the flap that night and the next day and the night after. The string of lights, Prout working, Sorensen gray and still on the cot fighting his silent fight, and Mara next to him, half dead herself, holding his hand, refusing sleep, watching his chest go up and down like she was personally responsible for each breath. Like if she looked away, it might stop. Like she'd carried him too far to lose him to a tent. The whole team rotated through. We couldn't stay away. There was nothing for us to do. We'd have only been in Prout's way, but we couldn't make ourselves go far. We'd stand outside the tent in the cold in little clumps, not talking much, and every so often one of us would duck inside just to look, just to confirm with our own eyes that the impossible thing was still true, that he was still there, that we hadn't dreamed him out of the ground. Carter took the cold coffee, the one he'd set in the dirt at the memorial, 3 days cold now, frozen at the bottom, and he poured it out and made fresh, and he brought a cup and set it on the crate next to Mara's cot. Didn't say anything, just set it down where it would be there when she wanted it. The little brother, apologizing the only way he knew how, except this time it wasn't an apology. This time it was a thank you so big there were no words for it, so he used coffee instead. She noticed. Of course she noticed. She noticed everything. She looked at the coffee and looked at Carter, and the corner of her mouth moved, just barely, the closest thing to a smile any of us had seen from her in days. She didn't drink it. She was too tired to drink it. But she put her free hand around it, just to hold the warmth, while her other hand held Sorensen's, and Carter went outside and stood in the dark, and I'm pretty sure he cried. And none of us said anything about it, because there are tears that a man has earned, and that's between him and the dark. Sorensen came back to us slowly over about 2 days, first just stable, then a flicker, his eyes moving under the lids, then on the second night, his hand tightening on Mara Quotes, and her sitting up so fast she nearly tore her IV out, and saying his name. He didn't wake up dramatic. There was no gasp, no sudden return. He just sort of surfaced, the way you come up from very deep water, slow, his eyes opening to slits, the string of lights above him swimming into focus. And the first thing he did, before he knew where he was, before he knew if he was alive or dead or dreaming, was to look for the source of the hand holding his. He found Mara Quotes' face, and he looked at her for a long moment, this gray, broken man, and we all held our breath. And then he said, in a cracked whisper, the very first thing he said on coming back from the dead. "I told you to leave me." And Mara, without missing a beat in that same flat, dry voice, said, "Yeah, you did, and I'm gonna let you write me up for it, soon as you can hold a pen." And Sorensen laughed. It was barely a laugh. It cost him something. You could see it hurt his chest. But it was a laugh, real, helpless, the laugh of a man who has just understood exactly what was done for him, and exactly who did it, and exactly what it means, and who has no idea how to hold all of that, so it comes out as a laugh. And then the laugh turned into something else, and his face came apart, and he turned his head away from us toward the canvas wall, and his shoulders shook. And Mara just held his hand tighther and let him, and didn't say anything, and didn't look away. We backed out of the tent, all of us. Without a word, by some shared instinct, we backed out and let the canvas flap fall, and we stood in the cold dark under those violent stars and gave the man some privacy to fall apart, because some things aren't for an audience, even an audience that loves you. Here's the part I promised you, the part about the rule. A few days later, when Sorensen could sit up, when the fever had broken and the worst was behind him and they were getting ready to move him to a real hospital, he asked OKONKWO to gather the team, all of us who could walk. He wanted to talk to us. We came into the tent and stood around his cot. Reyes was there too, on crutches, the leg they'd saved still wrapped, refusing to be left out. Mara was in the next cot over, sitting up now, looking more like herself, though her hands were still wrapped and would be for weeks. Soren looked at us for a while before he said anything. He had that way of looking at you with his whole face, the scar through his eyebrow. He looked at each of us in turn, and then he said, "I owe you all an apology." That was not what any of us expected. We started to protest, "Boss, no, you don't owe us anything, we're just glad you're," and he held up a hand and we stopped. "Let me say it," he said. "I made you swear an oath. I made you promise that if it was ever me, you'd leave. I drilled it into you. I told Carter to live loud enough for both of us. I made you believe it was the right thing, the only thing, and I made you believe it so well that when the moment came, you did it. You followed my order. You broke contact and you got the living out and you left me because that's what I told you to do." He paused, his jaw worked. "And every one of you has been standing around this tent for a week eating your own heart out about it. I can see it on you. You think you failed me. You think the difference between me living and dying was that you weren't brave enough to do what she did." He nodded at Mara. "And I need you to hear me. You did not fail me. You did exactly what I asked. You did the right thing, the smart thing. If you'd all turned around and charged back into that valley after me, into 60 guns, most of you would be dead now, and probably I'd be dead too, and June would have lost her father, and a half-dozen men who were like uncles to her would be gone. And for what? You made the right call. I'm ordering you right now to stop carrying this. That's an order, and it's the last one I'll give you on this deployment, and I expect it followed like all the others." Nobody could speak. I certainly couldn't. Then Carter, of course it was Carter, said in a small voice, "But she didn't leave, boss, and she was right." Soren was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something I've never forgotten, something I've turned over 1,000 times, something that I think is the truest thing anybody said in all those years. "She wasn't right," he said, "and she wasn't wrong. That's the thing none of you understand yet, and I hope to God most of you never have to. There's the right call, and then there's the thing love makes you do, and they're not the same. They're almost never the same." He looked at Mara, and she looked back at him, and there was that thing between them again, the trust that goes all the way down. "What she did was insane," Soren said. "It was against everything I trained her to do, against everything I trained all of you to do. By the numbers, she should have died out there, and I should have died under that rock, and she rolled the dice on both our lives against odds that no sane commander would ever take. If I'd been on that ridge and one of you had radioed me what she was about to do, I'd have ordered you to stop. I'd have been right to order you to stop." He shook his head slowly. "But she turned her radio off, so no one could be right at her, and she went and got me, and here I am." He looked down at his ruined leg and then back up at us. "So I'm not going to sit here and tell you the lesson is to always go back, because that lesson gets people killed. The rule is the rule for a reason, and the rule is go, and the rule saved most of your lives that day, and I'd make you swear it again tomorrow." "Then what's the lesson, boss?" Onkwo asked. His voice was rough. Soren thought about it. "The lesson," he said finally, "is that you'd better build a team where when the right call is go, you've got at least one person crazy enough to stay. Not so you can count on it. You can't count on it. It'll get you killed if you count on it. But so that on the one day in 1,000 when the math is wrong, when the man under the rock is still breathing and nobody knows it but one set of eyes 1,000 meters up on that one day, somebody's there." He looked at Mara. "I don't recommend it. I'd never order it, but God help me, I'm glad it exists in the world. I'm glad she exists in the world. My daughter's glad too, even though she doesn't know it yet." That last part undid Mara a little. The only time in the whole thing I saw her come close to coming apart. When he said my daughter's glad too, her composure flickered and she looked down at her wrapped hands and she said very quietly, "You kept singing. Under the rock. That's how I found you. You wouldn't stop singing." Soren nodded. "It was the only thing I could think to do," he said. "I figured if I was going to go, I'd go with her in my head, the song." He smiled, faint and crooked. I always get the words wrong. She loves it. She won't let me fix it. I know, Mara said. I heard. I had to learn it from you down there, sang it back to you the last morning when you started to quit on me. You wouldn't quit after that. She looked up at him. I sang it wrong on purpose. I figured the wrong words would bring you back faster than the right ones. Son looked at her for a long moment. And then this big, quiet, decided man who hadn't cried in front of his team in years before that week reached over with the hand that wasn't an IV pincushion and took Mara Quote's wrapped, ruined hand in his, careful, the way she'd carried him careful, and he held it. And he said, "You'll sing it to her someday, June. You're going to meet her and you're going to sing her that song, wrong words and all, and I'm going to stand there and watch, and I'm not going to be able to say anything because there won't be anything to say. That's a promise. That's the only order I'll ever give you that I'm asking you to follow for the rest of your life. You're going to meet my kid." Mara, the sniper who never wasted a word, didn't have one. She just nodded. And outside the tent, the wind came down off the mountains, and the canvas breathed, and somewhere far below the clouds the river ran on, splitting and splitting into smaller streams until it forgot itself entirely in the rocks. And inside, under a single string of lights, a dead man held the hand of the woman who'd refused to let him be dead, and the rest of us stood around them in the cold and the warmth at the same time, and not one of us would ever be exactly the same again. They flew him out 3 days later. I remember the helicopter coming in for the medevac, the same kind of bird that had carried us out of the valley a week before, except this time we were loading a man we'd grieved as dead onto a litter and watching him go toward life instead of away from it. The whole team came out to the pad. We weren't supposed to, there was no reason for all of us to be there. It wasn't tactical, it wasn't necessary. But Okonkwo didn't say a word about it, and neither did anyone else, because some things you just do. Sorensen was awake for it. Pale, strapped down, his leg in a real splint now, IV bag swaying above him. As they carried him to the bird, he made them stop. Made them stop the litter right there on the pad with the rotors turning and the dust coming up, and he looked at each of us, one at a time, the way he always did with his whole face. He didn't make a speech. He'd already said what he had to say in the tent. He just looked at us, and then he raised one hand. It cost him. You could see it cost him. And he held it flat against his chest for a second over his heart, and then he turned the hand out toward us. I don't know if it was a salute or a thank you or a goodbye or all three at once. It didn't need a name. We came to attention. All of us, even Ray's on his crutches, even Mara with her wrapped hands. We held it while they loaded him. We held it while the bird lifted off and the dust blew over us and the sound hammered down. We held it until he was a dot, and then nothing, swallowed up into the white sea of clouds that sat below the peaks. And then it was just us again, on an empty pad in the cold, with a man alive on the other end of that flight who a week ago we'd put boots in the dirt for. Carter said Tuesday, and we all looked at him. He shrugged, a little wet around the eyes. It happened on a Tuesday, the bad thing, but the good thing, him coming back, her walking in, that was a Saturday. He sniffed. I'm gonna start liking Saturdays. Nobody laughed exactly, but something loosened in all of us. Okonkwo put his hand on the back of Carter's neck, the way Sorensen used to, and said, "Yeah, kid, Saturdays." Mara stayed with us a little longer before she rotated out. Her hands needed time. Prout wanted to keep an eye on the head wound. And I think, though she'd never have said it, she wasn't ready to be alone yet. Some things you survive, and then the surviving catches up with you, and you don't want to be by yourself when it does. She was quieter than before, if that was even possible. But there was a different quality to it. Before, her stillness had been the stillness of total attention, a person watching the world. Now there was something underneath it that hadn't been there, some weight she was carrying that wasn't physical. I think she'd looked at something out there in those 3 days, at the edge of what a person is, at how thin the line is between getting them home and not, and you don't look at that and come back unchanged. None of us came back from that deployment unchanged. But Mara had gone the deepest into it, alone in the dark, and she carried the most of it out. The last night before she left, I sat with her outside, against the same sandbags where Okonkwo and I had talked the night of the memorial. The stars were doing their violent thing overhead. She had Carter's coffee. He'd kept making it for her, every day, and she'd started actually drinking it. I asked her how she was doing. The real question, the Sorensen way, not the automatic one. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "You know the worst part, it wasn't the digging, it wasn't the carrying, it wasn't even running out of water." She turned the cup in her ruined hands. "The worst part was the doubt. Every single step, this voice telling me I was carrying a dead man, that he'd died an hour ago and I just hadn't noticed, that I was killing myself and maybe getting you all in trouble, hauling a corpse across a valley for nothing. 3 days of that voice. And the only way to shut it up was to keep going, because the second I stopped to check, the second I admitted I might be wrong, that's when I'd have set him down. So I just didn't let myself find out. I kept moving so the doubt couldn't catch me. Same reason I turned the radio off." She gave a tired ghost of a laugh. "Turns out the whole trick was just refusing to let the truth get a word in until I was good and ready to hear it." "And if you'd been wrong," I asked, "if he had died on your back somewhere out there?" She thought about it. She always thought about it. "Then I'd have carried a dead man home," she said simply. "And that would have been the right thing to do too. You don't leave them out there, Stitch. Alive or dead. You don't leave them. Everything else is just details." "I've thought about that a lot. You don't leave them. Everything else is just details. I think it might be the only philosophy I've ever actually believed all the way down." She rotated out the next morning, hugged each of us, which surprised everyone because Mara wasn't a hugger. When she got to Carter, she held on an extra second and said something to him that none of us heard, and Carter went red and nodded hard, and after she'd gone, he wouldn't tell us what it was. He never did. Some things stay between the people, therefore. I should tell you what happened to everybody, because that's part of telling it right. Ray's kept the leg, though he walked different after, and he got out a year later and opened a gym back home and named it after the team. And the wall by the door has that photo on it. The one of all of us grinning like idiots, Sorensen in the middle with that happy skeptical eyebrow. The photo we'd laid in the dirt at a memorial that turned out to be premature. Okonkwo made Master Chief and stayed in for a long time and trained up a whole generation of guys. And I know for a fact that somewhere in his speeches to the new ones, there's a part about how the rule is the rule and the rule is go, and you'd better mean it. And then there's a quiet part that he only gives to the ones he trusts, about the 1 day in 1,000 when the math is wrong, and about a woman who turned her radio off. Carter got better, grew into himself. The kid who'd cried on the flight out became a man you'd want next to you on the worst day of your life. He's got kids of his own now. He makes terrible coffee on purpose, he says, because the good stuff doesn't taste right anymore. Prute's a trauma surgeon now, in a real hospital, with all the machines and specialists he didn't have in that tent. He says he's never had a save that meant more than the one he got in a tent with canvas walls and a string of lights on a man who wouldn't quit. And me, I'm here telling you this, which I suppose tells you I made it too. But you want to know about Sorensen, and you want to know about June, and you want to know if Mara ever kept the promise, the only order he ever gave her for the rest of her life. So I'll tell you. Sorensen's leg never fully came back. He medically retired about 18 months after a long string of surgeries, walking with a cane he hated and pretended he didn't need. He went home to Carol and June for good. He coached June's soccer team from a folding chair on the sideline, yelling things that mortified her in the way that only a father can mortify a teenager, and she loved every second of it and would deny it to her dying day. He's got grandkids on the horizon now, he tells me. He's got the whole long, ordinary, beautiful life that he was supposed to lose under a mountain in a valley where the river forgets itself. He calls Mara every year on the anniversary, Not the anniversary of the bad day. The anniversary of the Saturday. The day she walked back in. They don't talk long. They never were big talkers. But every year on that day, the phone rings and it's him, and they sit on the line together for a while, two people who shared the one thing that nobody else on earth can ever fully understand, and that's enough. That's more than enough. And about a year after it all happened, when Sorensen was healed up enough to have people over, he invited the team to his house. A barbecue. The kind of thing he could never have imagined wanting before, all that ordinary peace. And he invited Mara, and she came. I was there, I saw it. I saw a little girl with a gap finally filling in where her teeth used to be, 10 years old by then, come tearing across the yard because her dad had told her. He told her the whole thing when she was old enough, told her that an angel had dug him out of a mountain and carried him home so he could come back to her. And June had decided with the total certainty of a kid that this woman was that angel. I saw Mara, who'd faced down 60 enemy fighters and a collapsing mountain, and 3 days of her own doubt without flinching, go absolutely rigid with terror at the approach of one small girl. And I saw June stop in front of her and look up at her and say, "My dad says you carried him. He says you sang our song. He says you got the words wrong." And Mara, I will never forget this. I'd give a lot to forget less of what I saw in those years and to keep more of this. Mara got down on one knee in the grass, the same way she'd gone down on one knee at the wire to set Sorensen in the dirt, and she said, "I did get the words wrong. On purpose. You want to hear?" And right there, in a backyard, on an ordinary afternoon, with a beer going warm on the table and the rest of us pretending very hard to be looking at something else, Mara Quinn sang a little girl her own bedtime song. The wrong words and all. Sang it badly, on purpose, the way she'd sung it into a dying man's ear in the open dark of an enemy valley to keep his heart beating one more mile. And June laughed and said, "That's not how it goes," and corrected her, the way she corrected her father, and Mara said, "Then teach me." And the little girl did, and the two of them sat in the grass getting it wrong together while a man who should have died under a mountain stood leaning on a cane he pretended he didn't need and watched and couldn't say anything. Because there wasn't anything to say. He'd told her there wouldn't be. People ask me when I tell this what the point of it is. What's the lesson? We like our war stories to have a lesson. I used to try to give them one. I'd talk about loyalty or courage or never leaving anyone behind. All true, all too small. Now I just tell them what Sorensen told us in the tent, the truest thing I ever heard. That there's the right call, and then there's the thing love makes you do, and they're almost never the same. That the rule is the rule for a reason, and the rule will save your life. And that you'd still better build yourself a life, a team, a family, whatever you've got, with at least one person in it crazy enough to break the rule on the one day in 1,000 when the math is wrong. Not so you can count on it. You can't. But so that it exists in the world. So that on the worst day, when everyone's done the right thing and the right thing isn't enough, somebody turns their radio off and goes back into the valley. We grieved our commander. We did everything right. We put his boots in the dirt and we said the words and we made our peace, because that's what you do, that's what survives you. And then a small woman with ruined hands walked out of the foothills in the last gold light of the day, carrying him on her back, singing a child's song so neither of them would stop. She set him down at our feet and she said, "He's been alive the whole time. Somebody help me." And somewhere a girl with a gap in her teeth, holding a fish too big for her arms, didn't grow up without her father. You don't leave them. Alive or dead, you don't leave them. Everything else is just details.